We're now on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, and we're presenting a machlokas about Avelis b'Shabbos. One opinion, we don't know if it's the Bnei Golil or the Bnei Yehuda, Yesh Avelis b'Shabbos, which means that Dvarim shebetzina, private acts of Avelis, like for example, avoiding cohabitation, that's Dvarim shebetzina, that would apply on Shabbos of Avelis. Why? Because Shabbos is not a day of Simcha per se. It's a day of Oneg. Hani Amri, according to the other view, Ein Avelis b'Shabbos means klal. There's no Avelis even b'dvarim shebetzina. Man di Amri yesh Avelis b'Shabbos di Katani ola. Okay, we have to take a little bit of a pause here to understand what is the raya from the word ola. The Ritva is very critical here. He says that you can talk about Shabbos, and the Mishnah could have used one of two possible conceptual formulations. One would be that Shabbos is min ha-minyan. The other is that Shabbos is ola. What's the difference between these two phrases? Min ha-minyan or ola? Says the Ritva, min ha-minyan means that it's counted. It's one of the 7 days of Avelis. Ola means that it's integrated into the fabric of Avelis. It's not just that we calculate the Shiva and include this as one of the days. But Ola means that there's some active participation in Avelis. And the word that the Mishnah chooses here is not min ha-minyan, but rather Ola. And that proves that Yesh Avelis b'Shabbos. Ola indicates an active kiyum or niyug of Avelis. And that's in Dvarim shebetzina, and that proves the shita that Yesh Avelis b'Shabbos. Mandi Omer Ein Avelis b'Shabbos, the Katani Eino Mafsekes. Eino Mafsekes means that it doesn't break up the Shiva, whereas Yontif would break up the Shiva. Okay, it doesn't break up the Shiva. Maybe that's because there is a Kiyum Avelis. How does he derive from the fact that it says Eino Mafsekes? How does that prove that there's no Avelis whatsoever during Shabbos of Shiva? Maybe Eino Mafsekes is Adarab. On the contrary, it's not Mafsekes because as opposed to Yontiv, Shabbos has Dvarim shebetzina. There is Niyug Avelis. Oh. So let's take a look at the Gemara. Isal kedaitoch yesh Avelis b'Shabbos. According to you, that there is Avelis on Shabbos, is hashta Avelis naga afsuke mi boy? The Mishnah had to exclude a havamina that Shabbos would be mafsik the Avelis. You're telling me there's a kiyum Avelis, and Shabbos is an integral part of the Shivas Yimei Avelis. How then can you possibly suggest that the Mishnah had to go out of its way to say Eino Mafsekes? What do you mean Eino Mafsekes? That's upcorrect, as we say in Yiddish. He's fulfilling the mitzvah of Avelis, albeit b'tzina, during Shabbos. So Shabbos is a chelek, it's a tale of the Avelis. But if you hold that there's no Avelis b'Shabbos, then there was a havamina that if there's no Avelis b'Shabbos whatsoever, it's like Yontiv, then it should be a mafsik. And that's why the Mishnah Kamashma wants to tell me the Chiddush that it's not a mafsik. But now the Gemara asks, according to that second Mandiyama, who says that there's no Avelis at all on Shabbos during Shiva, Elahadik Tani Ola. What does it mean, Ola? We said that Ola is not the same as Min ha-minyan. The Mishnah should have used the word that Shabbos is Min ha-minyan, be counted in the 7 days, even though there's no Niyug Avelis whatsoever, even in Dvarim shebetzina. But if the Mishnah says Ola, that's a whole different story. Ola means it's part of the Avelis. There's an active niyug of Avelis, which makes sense if you hold like the other man, the Omer, Yesh Avelis b'Shabbos. So Gemara says, Aidi the Ktani Seifa, Ktani Reisha, one of those Aidis that we're familiar with, to maintain the symmetry of the Mishnah. Aidi the Kabbalah Mishnah Seifa, Einam Olim. In the case of Yont, the Mishnah wanted to emphasize that there's no kiyum of niyug Avelis at all during Yontif. Zilch, zero. And that's called Einam Olim. Olim means an active niyug Avelis. Ein Olim means that on Yontif there's no active niyug Avelis. Is therefore Tani Reisha, Tani Nami Reisha, Ola. So in the case of Shabbos, the Mishnah uses the word Ola just to contrast it with the Seifa of Eino Ola in the case of Yontif. But in truth, the Mishnah had it been free of the shackles of the Seifa, and had it just had the Reisha, and forget about Yontif, just take Shabbos as an independent, closed entity, then the Lashon would have been Eino Minam Minyan. And you, excuse me, that's Minam Minyan, that we count the day of Shabbos as one of the seven, even though there's no niyug Avelis whatsoever. So don't get nervous and alarmed by the fact that the Mishnah uses the word Ola. It doesn't mean Ola the way we understand Ola as an active participation, an integral part of niyug Avelis. There's no Avelis on Shabbos. Ulaman the Yomi Yesh Avelis b'Shabbos hakatani einam afsekes. Why did the Mishnah have to tell me einam afsekes? You're talking about Yesh Avelis b'Shabbos. Avelis extends and includes Shabbos as well. And on Shabbos, he's going to be noeg Avelis. So you have to tell me einam afsekes? And the answer is Mishum de B'Kaboy L'Misnei Seifa Mafsikin is Tana Reisha Eina Mafsekes, for the sake of maintaining the symmetry of the Mishnah. And in the Seifa, he wants to tell you Mafsekes, that Yontif comes along and interrupts Shiva. So your counting of Shiva will begin after Yontif or will be complemented after Yontif in a Hashlama situation. So once in the Seifa, he needs to use the word Mafsekes to tell you that Yontif is Mafsekes, Tananami Reisha. Even in the case of Shabbos, he uses the term Eino Mafsekes. But in truth, again, there's no Havamina that Shabbos would be Mafsik, according to Mandiyom Yesh Avelos b'Shabbos. Lema Ketanoi, perhaps this machlokes about whether there's Avelos on Shabbos is in fact a machlokes Tanoi. And now we take a look at a brisa about Onain. Onain is a person who lost one of his close relatives before the Kvura, and that's called Meso Mutal Lefana. Ochel b'bais acher. If he has two houses, he should change his location from the normal house where he usually would eat his meal, and he should eat in another house. But ein lo bais acher, he's not so wealthy. He doesn't own two batim. Ochel b'beis chavero. In a case of an onain, where the mesa mutal lefana, the body is there, he should not be eating in the same place as the body. Eat in another house. And if you don't have another house, eat in your friend's house. Mooch an invitation to your friend's house. Ein lo beis chavero. He lives down in, I don't know where, somewhere in the sticks of South Carolina. There are no Jews around. And he has no beis chavero to avail himself of. So what should he do? He's got to eat. Oselo mechitza sar tfachim. He should structure a partition, and every mechitza has to have a minimum of 10 tfachim, and that separates one rishus from the other. So the corpse will be in one side of the mechitza, meaning in one rishus, and he will eat in another rishus. But ein lo davar lasas mechitza. What if he doesn't have anything to make a mechitza? Machzir panav, at least turn his face away from the dead, which I think anyone would do normally anyway, even if the halacha didn't require that. And ochel, and he eats. When he eats, it's not Be'aseva, so that the night of Pesach is the antithesis of Avelus. It's Haseva. He reclines in a state of Simcha. But now he's in a state of Avelus. And Eino Mesiv V'yochen. V'eino ochel basar v'eino shel yain. Aninus generates an Isur Achilas Basar and Shesias Yayin. And obviously, the Onain is not going to be allowed to make Kiddush unless you hold Ein Avelus B'Shabbos. What about Havdalah and Motzei Shabbos? Let it make Havdalah on Chamer de Medina, on, let's say in the classic case, a bottle of beer, of Sheikha. And we have this problem during the 9 days because we don't eat meat during the 9 days. We don't drink wine during the 9 days. It's Avelus Yeshana for the Churban. What do we do on Motzi Shabbos when we're back to the state of Avelus and we have Havdalah after Shabbos, which requires Yayin? And they say that you can make Havdalah Yayin, but let a child who's very young drink from the kos. The Ein Mizamen, he does not recite Birkas HaMazon. The Ein Mivarchim Olah. And no one should be making a bracha on his behalf to be motzi him midin shomer ka'oneh, because he is an ovel. He is, to be more precise, an onen, and he's potem in a mitzvahs. Ein mezamnin olav. We cannot add him to a duet to make a trio for zimun. Upotem ikriyas ma minat filo minat filin umikol mitzvahs hamuros pator. Now let's try to explain what this Tur Min HaMitzvahs essentially is. An onen, one of the close relatives who lost his relative, is obligated in the mitzvah of kavura, of burying the dead. And we have a principle that osek b'mitzvah potem min ha-mitzvah. Therefore, the onen, insofar as he is obligated and singularly dedicated to the burial of his dead, he's potem min ha-mitzvahs. But you might ask why tefillin is singled out over here. And the answer is because in tefillin, there's an exclusion that's not based on osek b'mitzvah potem min ha-mitzvah. That exclusion of tefillin is because of pe'er. Tefillin is called pe'er, and the avel is megolel ba'ofer. He's the opposite of pe'er. And then afkamina is the following. Before kvura, you could apply the principle of osik b'mitzvah potem min ha-mitzvah, and therefore you wouldn't wear tefillin. But after kvura, let him put on his tefillin. And this brisa reflects the opinion that during the entire first day of Shiva, he doesn't wear tefillin, even after the kvura. And that's despite the fact that there's no halacha of osik b'mitzvah here. He's already buried the dead. But nevertheless, tefillin is pe'er, And there's a special halacha on the first day of Avelus of Achrisa Kiyom Mar, and that Marirus of that first day, the day in which he lost his relative, buried his relative, is going to preclude tefillin, because tefillin requires a different mentality, a different state of mind, called pe'er. Now, I'm just going to say a vard here. This is probably not true, but maybe the reason why tefillah is mentioned here is because the onen will go through a transition after burial. And after burial, he has, as an Avel, a special mitzvah of tefillah. So from Aninus to Avelus is going from one extreme to the other. During Aninus is no tefillah, and once the dead is buried and he now he transfers over to the level of an Avel, then he has a special chiyuv of tefillah. And that's why we call upon the Avel to be the Shliach Tzibur, because of his unique, intense chiyuv of tefillah. Ubeshabbos, and now we have to understand whether there is or is not Avelus b'Shabbos. So according to the Tanakama, Mesiv v'ochel basa v'shosei yayin, umevarech, umezamen, umevarchim, umezamnin, olav, v'chayev, b'kriyat shma, ubetfila, ubetfilin, v'chol mitzvos hamuras b'Torah. Now you have to take out the word tefillin here because we're talking about Shabbos. But it means he's obligated on Shabbos and all the mitzvahs. We suspend Aninus because he cannot be osik b'mitzvah of Kvura on Shabbos. And once we suspend the status of an onen, he becomes chayiv in all the mitzvahs. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, mitoch she'nischayvu b'elu, nischayvu b'kulon. What does that mean? That on Shabbos, since he's chayiv in Kriyat Shema and in Tefillah and in Birkas HaMazon, etc., therefore he's chayiv b'kulon. What does that mean, b'kulon? Amar Rav Yochanan, Ashrish Hamita Ika Beinayim. The question now is Dvarim Shebetzina. And this price of Rabbi Gamliel says this chayvu b'kulon, it means even the mitzvah of ona, and there's no dvarim shebetzina on Shabbos of Avelus. The Tanakama, on the other hand, holds that an onen is, number one, obligated all the mitzvahs on Shabbos. However, he's not chayiv in the mitzvah of Tashrish Abit of Ona, because Dvarim Shebetzina on Noeg on Shabbos, and this reflects one shita. Rabbi Gamliel, on the other hand, reflects the other shita, that there's no Avelus at all on Shabbos, and therefore he's allowed and obligated to conduct himself in the midst of Ona and have marital relations with his wife. My Labahaka Mifli, the Marsavar Yesh Avelus Shabbos, the Tanakama holds there is Avelus, and therefore Dvarim Shebetzin on Noeg, and Tashmish Amita is also. Marsavar, according to the other man, the Bomar, Ein Avelus b'Shabbos. Rabbi Gamliel holds that there is marital relations on Shabbos because Ein Avelus b'Shabbos, even b'Dvarim Shebetzin. Gemara says, Mimai. How do you know that the Tanakama holds that there is Avelus b'Shabbos and Ram Gamliel holds there's no Avelus b'Shabbos? let's be argumentative about it. Ilma, perhaps. Ad kan lo kamer Tanakama hasam elamishum de meso mutalafana. Why was it that the Tanakama was machmir? That's only because the Tanakama was addressing a case of meso mutalafana. That's a real serious avelus. Onen is meso mutalafana. So when the Tanakama says just 1 second, that when the Tanakama holds that on Shabbos there's no mitzvah of Ona and there's an Isur of Tashrish Hamida, he's talking about Meso Mutalafana. And that undermines even the mitzvah of Ona, because of the severity of Aninus. But if we're talking about Shiva after the mess was buried already, then there's a Hakola in the Avelus during Shiva. And the same Tanakama would say that marital relations are mut. Ashabit is mut, tzvar mitzvah, and it's mut. Because Avelus, in comparison to Aninus, is Kal. V'yad kan lo koma Rab Gamliel hasam. And we might raise the following possibility, that where does Rab Gamliel allow a leniency on Shabbos of Tashrish Hamida that's only in Aninus? The Akati lo chal Avelus olah. Aninus is just a ptur. He's not chayiv in any mitzvahs. But once we get into Avelus, then he's chayiv in mitzvahs, and it could be, and that's a possibility the Gemara is raising, that Rabbi Gamliel would agree that there's an Isur Tashrish Hamida. Al hacha the chal Aveluso oleh is hachinami. It's very possible that Rabbi Gamliel would agree that Tashrish Hamida is us. So we'll take I think we have a little bit of time. So we'll take a little bit of time now to begin Daf Chaf Daled. Boy minei Rabbi Yochanan mishmuel. Here's a suffix of Rabbi Yochanan. Yesh avelos b'Shabbos or ein avelos b'Shabbos. Amar lei ein avelos b'Shabbos. So Shmuel was Mekil, and there's no Dvarim shebetzina on Shabbos of avelos, of Shiva. Yasvi Rabbanan Kamei de Rav Papa Beka'amri B'Shmei de Shmuel Avel Sheshimesh Mitaso B'Yimei Evlo Chayev Misa B'Dei Shamayim. Amalei Rav Papa Aser Itmar. We said that an Avel is Aser, is forbidden from Tashrish Hamida, but we never said that it's Chayev Misa if he violates that Isur. Umishmei de Rabbi Yochanan Itmar, and we said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So he says, "V'yishmiel lechu mishmei de Shmuel hachi shmielu." Amar Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi Amar Shmuel Avel shelo para v'lo pirem chayav misa. If the Avel did not let his hair grow long, meaning he cut his hair, or he did not rend his clothing for real avelus, then he's chayav misa. He's liable to die. And Nemar, as the pasuk says, "Rashechem al tifro, bigdechem al lo tifromu, v'lo tamusa." Ha'achar, acher, I should say. Ha'acher shalo parav shalo pirim chayav misa. All right, I'll just read the next. It's a little bit scary. Amar Rav from Bar Papa, Tana bi'avel rabasi, avel also is coming shvitos me ivlo, umaisa bi'ech shishimish bitasa b'mei ivlo, v'shamtu chazirim es v'yasa. And if you take that literally, it means that they couldn't bury his body. He did not have a proper burial, all because he was mishamish bitaso during Avelus. There's another interpretation here that the word gviyaso means his male organ, and that was bitten off by a swine. All right. I'd like to end with perennials, so we'll end with a tefillah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should spare us of any avelus, and that all these halachas that we're learning should be theoretical and not practical. So I wish you a great Shabbos. Thank you so much.